Classic starts, Little Lord Fauntleroy. Chapter 1. A Great Surprise. Dearest, Cedric said to his mama. Dearest, is my papa better? Cedric called his mama dearest, just like his papa had. Cedric's papa had been terribly ill, and Cedric had been sent away until he got better. But when the boy returned, he found Dearest sitting in her chair by the window. She was dressed in black, and her pretty face looked very sad. Cedric went to her. He felt her arms tremble. There was something in her face that made his heart beat fast with worry. Dearest, he said again quietly, is Papa well? Suddenly he knew what to do. He wrapped his arms around her neck, and he kissed her again and again. She put her face on his shoulder and started sobbing. She was holding on to him tightly, as if she would never let go. Yes, he is well, Dearest said at last. But we have no one left but each other. Cedric was only a little boy, but somehow he understood. His big, handsome papa was not coming back. He was dead. A few years passed. Dearest cried whenever he asked about his papa, so Cedric secretly decided not to talk about him. He remembered a few things about his papa. His name was Captain Cedric Errol. He was very tall and had blue eyes and a mustache. Cedric remembered how wonderful it felt when his papa carried him around on his shoulders. That's what Cedric remembered most. He also knew that his papa was not from New York, where he and Dearest lived. His papa was from England. Cedric thought that was why his papa's family never visited. They were too far away. His mama's family never visited either, but that was because she had no family. She was an orphan. Before Dearest married his papa, she had worked for a rich old lady who was not kind to her. One day, Captain Errol was visiting the old lady's house and noticed Cedric's mama running up the stairs. From that moment on, the captain couldn't stop thinking about her. She looked so sweet, so innocent. He came back to visit again and again. He fell in love with her, and soon quicker than anyone could have guessed they were planning to get married. This marriage made some people very unhappy, even angry. The captain's father was especially upset. He was the Earl of Dorincourt, a rich and important nobleman who lived in a fine, beautiful castle. He was known for having a terrible temper. He also hated America and Americans. The Earl had two sons who were older than Captain Cedric. The oldest son was a lord. He would one day become the Earl of Dorincourt after the old Earl died. If the first son died, the second son would become the Earl's heir. As for the third son, he would only become a lord if both of his brothers died. More than likely, he would never be the Earl of Dorincourt. He would never even be very rich, since most of the family fortune would go to his older brothers. Captain Cedric knew this, but it didn't matter to him. He was a kind young man, and very handsome. He was also brave and generous. Everyone loved him. His older brothers were not handsome or kind or smart. They wasted their time and money and had very few real friends. The Earl's two older sons were a disappointment. They embarrassed him. His heirs were not an honor to his noble name. The Earl thought it was the worst of luck that his third son had all the gifts. The beauty and the charm and the smarts, these should have gone to the son who would one day become Earl of Dorincourt. On his third son, these qualities were wasted. The Earl hated comparing his third son to the older brothers. His presence was a constant reminder of their failures. And so the Earl sent his third son far away, to America. That way, the old Earl wouldn't have to see him and be reminded of his other son's faults. 6 months passed, and the Earl became lonely. He didn't say it out loud, but he missed his youngest son. He wrote Captain Cedric a letter and asked him to come home. At the same time, Captain Cedric wrote his father a letter. He told him of the sweet, pretty American girl he wanted to marry. He asked his father for his blessing. But he didn't get it. When the Earl received the letter, he was furious. For a whole hour, he raged around his castle like a tiger. Then he sat down and wrote a nasty response. Captain Cedric was never to come home again. He was not to write to his father or his brothers. He could live however he wanted. He could die wherever he wanted. He would be cut off from his family forever. And he would never get help from his father for as long as he lived. The captain was heartbroken. At first, he didn't know what to do. He had no work experience, but he did have courage, and he wouldn't give up. He soon found a job in New York and married the girl he loved. His new life was very different from the one he had known in England. But he was young and full of hope. He rented a small, humble house on a quiet street. It was a happy home. It was where he lived with his new wife, and where his son was born. The captain was never once sorry for what he did. His little boy, Cedric, was sweet and charming. He had curly golden hair and big brown eyes with impossibly long eyelashes. He was very handsome. The boy was also friendly and well-mannered. When he was out on the street, he smiled at strangers and looked them straight in the eye. He talked to everyone, asking after their business, their health, and their family. People found him to be quite amusing. His greatest friend was the grocery man on the corner, Mr. Hobbs, who was known as the grumpiest man around. But Cedric could make even Mr. Hobbs smile. Cedric had a kind heart and was quick to understand other people's feelings. This may have been because he never heard a mean word at home. He had always been loved and treated tenderly. He had always heard his mama called by pretty, loving names, and so he used them himself when he spoke to her. And he had always seen his papa watch over his mama, so he made sure to take good care of her, too. And so when Cedric learned that his papa wasn't coming back, and he saw how sad Dearest was, he knew that he needed to make her happy. He climbed up on her knees, kissed her, and put his head on her shoulder. He brought her toys and picture books to show her. When she lay down on the sofa, he curled up quietly at her side until she woke up and talked with him again. He was a greater comfort to her than he realized. "Oh, Mary," he heard her say once to her faithful housekeeper and maid, "I know he is trying to help me. He looks at me sometimes with this curious little look, as if he knows how my heart feels. As if he is sorry for me. Then he shows me something to put my mind on other things. He is such a little man already." Cedric always acted older than his years. He learned to read when he was very little. He would lie on the rug in the evenings and read aloud, sometimes stories, and other times big books that grown-ups would read. Sometimes he even read the newspaper. Cedric didn't know what all the big words meant, but he sounded them out and asked for help with the stranger spellings. He was especially interested in politics. Dearest and Mary would laugh in delight at the funny things he would say. Mary was fond of Cedric. She had been helping his mother ever since he was born. She was proud of how graceful he was and of his fine manners. She especially adored his bright curly hair, which fell just past his ears. Mary liked to sew him small suits that made him look like a tiny gentleman. "You look like a young lord," she would tell him. And Cedric would laugh and be a little confused. He didn't think he looked like a young lord. He didn't even know what a lord was. Cedric thought Mr. Hobbs was a very rich and powerful person, like a lord, he supposed. Mr. Hobbs had so many things in his store: prunes and figs and oranges and biscuits, and he had a horse and a wagon. Cedric was fond of the milkman and the baker and the shoeshine boy and the apple woman who worked near the park, but he liked Mr. Hobbs the best. He would visit the grocery store every day and pull up a stool to talk to Mr. Hobbs. And they would talk for hours, the grumpy grocery man and the sweet 7-year-old boy who had lost his father. It was quite surprising how many things Cedric and Mr. Hobbs found to talk about. The 4th of July, for instance. They could talk about the American Day of Independence for a long time. Mr. Hobbs had a very bad opinion of the British. He said they were great villains. What he liked were the patriotic heroes of America. He would even recite parts of the Declaration of Independence, and Cedric would get so excited that his heart would beat fast when he listened. One day when Cedric was visiting Mr. Hobbs, a very odd thing happened. They were talking about England and the Queen. Mr. Hobbs said that he did not like the English royalty. He did not like earls or dukes, and he was being very stubborn about it. "Did you ever know any dukes, Mr. Hobbs?" Cedric asked. "Or earls?" "In fact, I did not," said Mr. Hobbs. "But I don't like them." "Maybe they wouldn't be earls if they knew any better," said Cedric, starting to feel bad for the earls and the dukes. "Wouldn't they?" said Mr. Hobbs. "They just love it. It's all they want. They're a bad lot." Cedric and Mr. Hobbs were in the middle of this conversation when Mary appeared. Cedric thought that maybe she had come to buy some sugar, but she said that wasn't it. Her eyes were shining, like she was excited about something. "Come home, darlin'," she said to Cedric. "The mistress is wanting you." Cedric slipped down from his stool. "Goodbye, Mr. Hobbs," he said. "We'll talk more about the earls and dukes tomorrow." Mary was staring at him, shaking her head. "What's the matter, Mary? Has the sun given Dearest a headache?" Cedric asked anxiously. But Mary said it was not that. Cedric rushed home with her, feeling nervous. When they reached the house, there was a fancy carriage outside. Someone was in the little parlor talking to Dearest. Mary wouldn't let Cedric go into the parlor just yet. Instead, she hurried him upstairs to put on his best summer suit, the cream-colored one with the red belt. She told him to find his best shoes, too. When he was dressed at last, he ran down into the parlor. The visitor was a tall, thin old gentleman with a sharp, serious face. He was sitting in an armchair. Dearest was standing nearby with a pale face. There were tears in her eyes. "Oh, said Di," she cried. She ran to him and held him in her arms. The tall old gentleman rose from his chair and looked deeply at Cedric for a long while. He didn't seem displeased. And so, he finally said, "This is little Lord Fauntleroy." Chapter 2, Cedric's Friends. Cedric was stunned at the news. His grandfather, whom he had never seen, was an earl. Both of his uncles would have been earls, too, but they had died. His father would have been an earl if he hadn't died. And now, since only Cedric was left, he was to be an earl one day. Now he was to be called by the family name, Lord Fauntleroy. And he would have to go live in England. "Dearest," he said, "I'd rather not go all the way to England." "Must I go?" "I'm sorry," said Di, Dearest said, "but, yes, you must. I know your papa would wish you to go. He loved his home. I would be selfish if I didn't send you." Cedric didn't understand. He would miss his home and his friends. When Mr. Havisham, his grandfather's lawyer, had come to Cedric's house, the little boy had heard many exciting things. But it didn't make him feel any better to know that he would be a rich man when he grew up. He would have castles here and castles there. He would have tenants who lived on his lands, whatever that meant. But right now, he still had to leave his home and his friends. Cedric was especially troubled about leaving Mr. Hobbs. He went as soon as he could to tell him the news. Cedric knew that Mr. Hobbs didn't like earls. They had just been talking about it. So Cedric was very nervous when he said, "I am one, or I am going to be. I cannot lie to you." Mr. Hobbs was confused. "Something's the matter with your head," he said. "Are you feeling ill? Are you dizzy? It is a very hot day." "No, I'm not ill," said Cedric. "I'm sorry to say it's true, I am going to be an earl. Mr. Havisham was telling Dearest, and he's a lawyer. My grandfather sent him all the way from England to tell us." Mr. Hobbs stared wildly at Cedric. "Who is your grandfather?" he asked. Cedric took out a piece of paper from his pocket. I couldn't remember it, so I wrote it down, he said. And he read slowly, John Arthur Molyneux Errol, Earl of Dorincourt. He lives in a castle in 2 or 3 castles, I think. Now I have to go live with him. Cedric did not seem happy about his news. England is very far away, isn't it? He asked. Across the Atlantic Ocean, said Mr. Hobbs. That's the worst of it, said Cedric. I shall not see you again for a long time. I don't like to think of that, Mr. Hobbs. Even the best of friends must part, said Mr. Hobbs. The two were quiet for some moments. Then they began to talk of what Cedric would do once he became an earl. Cedric said he would be a good one. He would not be a tyrant. If there was another war with America, he would try to stop it, he told Mr. Hobbs. He said a great many things that would have surprised Mr. Havisham. Mr. Havisham didn't know very many young boys, especially boys as smart and good-hearted as Cedric. But there were many things that surprised Mr. Havisham. He had spent all of his life in England, and he was not used to Americans. He didn't know much about the life that Captain Errol had made for himself in America. When Mr. Havisham met Mrs. Errol in her plain, tiny home, he was surprised to find that he liked her. She was quite pretty, with a faint sad look on her young face. Mr. Havisham saw right away that she must have loved Captain Errol with all her heart. It was clear that she hadn't married him simply because he was an earl's son. When he told Mrs. Errol that the old earl wanted Cedric to live with him in England, she grew pale. He'll be taken away from me? She asked. But he is such a happiness to me. He is all I have. Her voice trembled. Mr. Havisham cleared his throat. I must tell you, he said, that the Earl of Dorincourt is not very friendly toward you. He does not like America or Americans. He was very angry about your marriage to his son, and he does not want to see you. His plan is for Lord Fauntleroy to live with him in Dorincourt Castle. The Earl offers you a home at Court Lodge, which is not very far from the castle. He also offers you a good income. Lord Fauntleroy may visit you, but you may not visit him. Mr. Havisham was embarrassed. He was afraid Mrs. Errol would begin to cry. But she didn't cry. She went to the window and stood with her face turned away from him. Then she said, Captain Errol was very fond of Dorincourt. It was a grief to him that he was parted from his home. He would wish he would wish for his son to go. Then she came back to the table. She looked at Mr. Havisham gently. I know, she said, then started again. I am sure the Earl would not be so unkind as to try to teach Cedric not to love me. And I know even if he tried, Cedric would still love me. As long as we may see each other, I will not suffer too much. She cares so much more for her son than she does for herself, Mr. Havisham thought. She doesn't realize how hard it will be for her. Madam, he said, I respect your decision. I assure you that every effort will be made so that Lord Fauntleroy will be happy. When Cedric arrived back home, he went into the parlor to talk to Mr. Havisham. Mrs. Errol left them alone. Cedric wanted to know what exactly an earl was, since one day he would be one. Mr. Havisham explained that an earl is a very important person in England. Like the president, Cedric said. Not exactly, said Mr. Havisham. An earl is often of very ancient lineage. What's that? Asked Cedric. A very old family, very, very old. Ah, said Cedric, I suppose it's that way with the apple woman in the park. She is so old, it would surprise you how she can stand up. She's 100 years old, I should think. I am afraid you did not quite understand me, Mr. Havisham explained. When I said ancient lineage, I didn't mean old age. I meant that the name of the family has been known in the world for a long time. The first Earl of Dorincourt was made an earl 400 years ago. Well, said Cedric. That was a long time ago. What does an earl do? A great many of them have helped to rule England. Some of them have been brave men and fought in great battles. I should like to do that, said Cedric. My papa was a soldier, and he was a very brave man, as brave as George Washington. I'm glad that earls are brave. That's a good thing. There is another good thing about being an earl, said Mr. Havisham slowly. Some earls have a lot of money. That is good, Cedric said innocently. I wish I had a lot of money. Why? Asked Mr. Havisham. Well, explained Cedric, there's the apple woman. If I were very rich, I would buy her a tent and a little stove. And then I'd give her a shawl so her bones wouldn't feel so bad. Her bones are not like our bones. They hurt when she moves. If I were rich enough to help her, I guess her bones would be all right. Avery, and what else would you do if you were rich? Asked Mr. Havisham. Of course I'd buy Dearest all sorts of pretty things. And then Dick Dash. Who is Dick? Mr. Havisham interrupted. Dick is one of the nicest shoeshine boys you ever knew. He's about 12 years old, I think. He works on the corner. Once, when I was very little, I was out with Dearest and she bought me a ball. The ball bounced into the street where the carriages and horses were. I began to cry. I was very little. Then Dick stopped shining a man's shoes and ran in between the horses and caught the ball for me. Ever since, we stopped to talk to him when we passed by. And what would you do for Dick? Asked Mr. Havisham, trying not to smile. I would help him buy out the shoeshine business, of course. Dick has the worst partner. His name's Jake. Jake cheats. He makes Dick look bad. If I were rich, I would make Dick the boss. Is there anything you would get for yourself if you were rich? Asked Mr. Havisham. Lots of things, Cedric said quickly. But first, I would give Mary some money for Bridget. That's her sister. Bridget has 12 children, and her husband, Michael, is out of work. And I think Mr. Hobbs would like a good watch. Just then, Mrs. Errol came in. I'm sorry to have left you for so long, she said to Mr. Havisham. But Mary's sister came to see me. This young gentleman, said Mr. Havisham, has been telling me about some of his friends, and what he would do for them if he were rich. Bridget is one of his friends, said Mrs. Errol. She is in great trouble now because her husband is very sick. Cedric slipped off his big chair. I think I'll go and see her, he said, and ran out of the room. Of Mrs. Errol, Mr. Havisham said, the Earl wanted me to let his lordship know that the change in his life would bring him money and the pleasures children enjoy. I was told to buy Cedric anything he wants, and to tell him that it is from his grandfather. If it would make Lord Fauntleroy happy to help this poor woman, the Earl might be pleased. Oh, that was very kind of the Earl. Cedric will be so glad. If you will allow me, said Mr. Havisham, I will give him £5 for Bridget and her family. That's $25, exclaimed Mrs. Errol. They could buy medicine and warm clothing. It would mean so much to them. Mrs. Errol left the room to find Cedric. Mr. Havisham has some news for you, she told him. News? Cedric said. His little face looked quite anxious. He was sorry for Bridget. Mrs. Errol brought Cedric back to the parlor. Said Di, she said, your grandpapa the Earl is very, very kind. He wishes you to be happy and to make other people happy. He gave Mr. Havisham a great deal of money for you. You can give some to Bridget now, enough to pay her rent and buy Michael everything he needs. Isn't that fine? Said Di. Isn't your grandfather good? She kissed his cheek. Cedric looked up in amazement. Can I have it now? He cried. She is just leaving. Mr. Havisham gave him the money, and Cedric flew out of the room. Bridget, they heard him shout. Bridget! Don't go! I have some money for you and Michael. My grandpapa gave it to me. Master said die, cried Bridget. This is so much money. Where is your mother? I must go and explain it to her, Mrs. Errol said. So she, too, left the room, and Mr. Havisham was alone for a while. He thought about the old Earl of Dorincourt, sitting in his giant, gloomy library at the castle. He was always ill with the gout, a disease that made his feet swell up. And he was always grumpy. There was never a more unpopular old nobleman than the Earl of Dorincourt, or a more selfish one. He had quite a lot of money, and he didn't like to share it. Cedric was a cheery, handsome little boy who cared about all his many friends. He was so very generous. Mr. Havisham thought of how rich Cedric would be one day. It will make a great difference, he said to himself. Chapter 3, Leaving Home. The week before they sailed for England, Cedric did many things, thanks to his grandfather. He helped the very old apple woman of ancient lineage by giving her a stove and a shawl and some money. When he gave her the money, she gasped. She could hardly believe her great fortune. Cedric also helped his friend Dick, the shoe-shine boy. He went to the corner to tell him the news. He said that he had become a lord and was in danger of being an earl if he lived long enough. Dick jumped, and his cap fell off. I didn't think I would like it myself, Cedric said. But I like it better now that I'm used to it. The one who is the earl now he's my grandfather is very kind. He sent me a lot of money. And I've brought some so you can buy the business from Jake. Cedric tried to speak steadily, but his voice trembled a little. Well, goodbye. And I hope business will be good. I'm sorry I'm going away. But I hope you'll write to me, because we were always good friends. And if you write, here's where you must send your letter. He gave Jake a slip of paper. And my name isn't Cedric Errol anymore. It's Lord Fauntleroy and goodbye, Dick. Dick blinked his eyes to keep from crying. He was so surprised, he didn't know what to say. I wish you wasn't going away, was all he got out. Then he blinked his eyes again. And when he opened them, Cedric was gone. Cedric also made Mr. Hobbs promise to write him and gave him a gold watch and chain. Mr. Hobbs was depressed about his friend leaving. He felt funny about taking such an expensive gift. He laid the case on his stout knee and blew his nose several times. There's something written on it, said Cedric. It says from his oldest friend, Lord Fauntleroy, to Mr. Hobbs. When this you see, remember me. I don't want you to forget me. Mr. Hobbs blew his nose very loudly again. I won't forget you, he said. And don't you forget me when you get among those British lords. I shouldn't forget you whoever I was among, said Cedric. I hope you will come see me sometime. I'm sure my grandfather would be pleased. You wouldn't stay away just because he's an earl, would you? I'd come to see you, replied Mr. Hobbs. So it was agreed that if Mr. Hobbs received an invitation from the earl to come and spend some time at Dorincourt Castle, he would ignore how he felt about earls and pack his suitcase right away. At last the day came for Cedric to leave for England. The trunks were taken to the ship, and the carriage waited at the door. When Mrs. Errol came downstairs, her eyes were large and wet. Her mouth trembled. Cedric put his arms around her. We liked this little house, dearest, didn't we? He said. And we will always like it, won't we? Yes, darling, she answered in a low voice. And then, before they knew it, they were on the ship. There was noise and confusion everywhere. Carriages were parked all along the shore. Big trunks and cases were being bumped down and dragged about. Sailors were hurrying to and fro. Officers were giving orders. Ladies and gentlemen and children and nurses were coming on board. Suddenly Cedric noticed someone coming toward him. It was a boy with something red in his hand. It was Dick. Dated. I've run all the way, Dick said, out of breath. Business has been prime. I bought this for you out of what I made yesterday. It's a handkerchief. A bell rang and he leaped away before Cedric had time to speak. Goodbye. Dick panted. I hope you like it. A few seconds later, Cedric saw him struggle through the crowd and rush off the ship just in time. Dick stood on the shore and waved his cap as the ship started to pull away. Cedric waved his new handkerchief back. It was made of bright red silk, with purple horseshoes and horses' heads embroidered on it. Goodbye, Dick, he shouted, hoping his friend could still hear him. Thank you. Chapter 4, in England. When they were far out on the ocean, Cedric's mother told him that his home was not to be hers. Cedric's grief was so great that Mr. Havisham realized it was wise to make sure that the boy's mother lived nearby and saw him often. Cedric wouldn't be happy without her. Mrs. Errol did her best to make sure her son wasn't afraid. My house is not very far from the castle, said Di, she said every time he asked. You can see me every day. You will have so many things to tell me. It's a beautiful place. Your papa told me about it. He loved it very much, and you will love it, too. I'd love it better if you were there, he said. Mrs. Errol had decided not to tell him that it was his grandfather's idea to keep them apart. She told Mr. Havisham that she didn't want Cedric to learn the truth until he was older. He wouldn't understand, she said. It wouldn't make sense to him that anyone could hate me. So all Cedric knew was that there was a strange reason he wasn't old enough to understand. Soon the ship reached England, and a carriage drove Mr. Havisham, Cedric, and Mrs. Errol to Court Lodge, where Mrs. Errol would live. They reached the house at night, so it was too dark to see what it looked like. Cedric saw only an open door. He could make out two servants standing in the doorway. The servants looked with curiosity at both the boy and his mother. They had heard all sorts of rumors. They knew all about the boy's mean old grandfather, with his gout and his bad temper. They knew how angry the Earl had been when his son had married this woman. They knew why Mrs. Errol had to live at the lodge, while her little boy lived at the castle. But they didn't know what sort of little lord he would be. Cedric pulled off his coat as if he was used to doing things for himself. Then he looked around the lodge. Dearest, he said, this is a very pretty house, isn't it? I'm glad you are going to live here. It's quite large, for. It was a large house, compared to the one in New York, but Mrs. Errol looked a little pale and upset. She pulled Mr. Havisham aside. Could he stay with me tonight? She asked in a low voice. Of course, Mr. Havisham answered quietly. I will go tell the Earl that we have arrived. Having to live apart from my little boy will be so very difficult, Mrs. Errol said sadly. Will you tell the Earl that I would rather not have the money? You cannot mean that. Mr. Havisham exclaimed. He pulled her away so Cedric wouldn't hear. I do mean it, she said. I must accept the house, and I thank him for it. It makes it possible for me to be near my child. But I have a little money of my own enough to live simply, and I would rather not take his. He will be very angry, Mr. Havisham said. He won't understand. I think he will, she said. Why should I accept gifts from the man who hates me so much that he takes away my own child? I'll deliver your message, Mr. Havisham replied. Mr. Havisham went to the castle, where he found the old Earl sitting by the fire in his easy chair. His bad foot was up on his footstool. Well, the Earl said, what's the news? Lord Fauntleroy and his mother are at Court Lodge, replied Mr. Havisham. They are in excellent health. The Earl made a gruff sound. What else? He asked. I don't care about the mother. What sort of lad is he? It is rather difficult to judge, Mr. Havisham said. He is only 7. A fool, is he? The Earl exclaimed. Clumsy? His American blood shows, does it? I don't know much about children, but I thought he was a rather fine lad. Well enough to look at, demanded the Earl. A very slight smile touched Mr. Havisham's lips. Rather a handsome boy, I think, as boys go. But I dare say you will find him somewhat different from most English children. I haven't a doubt, snarled the Earl. Rude little beggars, those American children. Second, not rude, said Mr. Havisham. He has lived more with older people than with children. Bad manners, shouted the Earl. Mr. Havisham didn't argue. When the Earl was upset, it was always better to leave him alone. So there was silence for several moments. Then Mr. Havisham said, I have a message from Mrs. Errol. I don't want any of her messages, growled the Earl. The less I hear of her, the better. This is rather important. She does not want the money you plan to give her. The Earl jumped. She wants to make me see her. She thinks I shall admire her spirit. I don't admire it. I won't have her living like a beggar at my gates. She is the boy's mother. She has a position to keep up. She shall have the money, whether she likes it or not. She won't spend it, said Mr. Havisham. I don't care. It will be sent to her anyway. She wants to give the boy a bad opinion of me. She has poisoned his mind against me. She hasn't, said Mr. Havisham. In fact, she would prefer that you not tell him why you keep him away from her. He is very fond of her. She thinks that if he knows the truth, he may not like you. The Earl sank back in his chair. His fierce old eyes gleamed. Come now, he said. You don't mean the mother hasn't told him? Not a word, my lord. The boy is ready to believe that you are the most loving of grandparents. And from what he learned of you in New York, he thinks you are very generous. He does, eh? Said the Earl. I give you my word of honor. But if you will pardon my saying so,